Hey everyone, it's Dan Clark again. I'm here to share another session of some bruised coding. This time I'm covering a thing that I kind of covered in another video, which was the received message chain uh, method that RSpec allows you to do to test out some old legacy code. And it's just a convenience method that allows you to not to have some things in place that make your test a little bit uglier. I'm going to be showing you how to uglify this stuff, and mostly because receive message chain it doesn't have as many nice things as receive does. So you can't do as many fun and neat things that you could, and so it is kind of a limitation, but it's designed to do that. The reason being is that if you have message chains, so like for instance, in this case, we have Game Fairy Gateway, right? So here we have Game Fairy Gateway. It's returning Get Fairy proclamation. So we have kind of a little bit of a message chain. Granted, this is a contrived example. There is nothing really, you would never really see this, but you would see something, you'd probably see stuff like this in your code, trying to get around having to pass messages around or pass objects around. And again, one of the things here that we're trying to overcome is breaking the law of Demeter. So the idea here is what the law of Demeter basically says is you don't want your messages or your objects to know too much about distant neighbors. So it's okay if neighbors know about each other, but once you have neighbors knowing about your other neighbors, then you start to get in trouble, and you start to couple your methods too closely, or your objects too closely, and it makes testing a little bit more difficult. I mean, that's the reason why we have the receive message chain helper method, because it helps in those sort of situations, those legacy sort of situations, to make your code a little bit easier. This is the kind of thing that you want to use as, I have no tests in place. I want to just get some tests in there so I know that the changes that I'm doing to refactor this code aren't going to break anything. So without further ado, let's get started on this. So like I said, what we have is we have a Game Fairy Gateway on the right, and what it's doing, it's essentially calling a Game Fairy Gateway, which in turn calls the Game Fairy and returns that Game Fairy so that the game can then call proclamation on that Game Fairy. I use this in another example, but it works because the tests, so we have two tests here, one check to see if what happens when the Game Fairy says that there's a tie, and another one to see what happens when the Game Fairy says there is a winner. So in both of these examples, we're using the receive message chain, and we're going to try and not use those. So let's get this started. So the way that the documentation, if you look at RSpec's relish documentation, you go to RSpec mocks and you go to the legacy code section under RSpec mocks, they will talk about the received message chain, and they are very clear in their warnings that this is probably a code smell if you're using received message chain. So that is definitely a document that I would highly recommend that you read and you kind of understand the points that they're trying to make here. And what they say is probably a better pattern that you should be using here instead of receive message chain are doubles. So what that means is we're going to be using doubles here to mock out both the Game Fairy Gateway, because what we're trying to test here is we're trying to test out the done method. We're trying to see if done is working properly when the Game Fairy is passing back a true or a false depending on the state of whatever. So we're going to use doubles. We're going to use two of them, one for Game Fairy Gateway and one for Game Fairy. And we already have, well, I guess we kind of already have one for Game Fairy Gateway here, in that we're stubbing out the receive or the Get Fairy proclamation method calls here with receive message chain. But we want to rip that. We want to replace it with something a little bit nicer. So let's do this. I'm going to do this in a very iterative fashion. I'm going to do it down and dirty, so bear with me. You're going to kind of see my thought process on how this is done. So first things first, we want to get rid of this. So actually, for now, let me just comment these two things out. Let's run this code. They should hopefully both fail, and they do. And what this is basically saying is that we're hitting the game fairy, and the game fairy, remember, well, if you watch my previous video, the code is essentially broken with the game fairy. The game fairy is always going to be reasoning grumpy game fairy, and that's why we're seeing the outlook is cloudy, try again later message. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a double, and we're going to use this double in both tests. So we want to put it up here, and we're going to use a let to define our game fairy. So we're going to say game fairy, and we're just going to make it a double. That's it. So a double is essentially just, well, like a dummy. It's just a testing object that we can throw messages at, and it'll just take them and kind of stuff like that. So I mean, we're gonna stub out some methods on it, but that's all you really need to know right now. So we're gonna have that game fairy. So now let's do something different. So instead of using receive message chain, what we're going to do is we're going to say allow game fairy gateway to receive, and we're going to receive the get fairy message. And what we can then say is we can say and return. We're going to return that game fairy that we just stubbed out above. So let me just make this window a little bit bigger. Do one more. Okay. So now it's essentially returning the game fairy, but we haven't told the game fairy to mock out anything. So what we're going to now say is we're going to have that game fairy receive, let's see, we're receiving the proclamation. And here we're going to now stub out what it should be returning. And here, what we were returning before was false, so we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to return false. So, all right, so let's see if I got this right. Let's just run it really quick. So let's save that. Let's see if one of these tests pass now. No, they both do not. Undefined method, receive for the mocks. Okay, so let's see what I did wrong. Oh, that's because this is not how you do it. It's 2. Now let's try it out. Okay, one of our tests is now passing. The test that we were just working on now passes. And that is because we stubbed out the messages that we wanted to, or the objects that we wanted to really just put up fakes, so that way we could test out the done method. So let's remove this because we don't need that anymore. We're going to do the same thing on, I'm sure some of you are clamoring like, oh, you don't have to do it this way, but I'm just kind of trying to drive home a point here. So I'm going to leave this as false, and we're going to see this test now fail. It still fails, but it fails differently. We're not getting the exception that's being raised by the grumpy game fairy. We're getting we expected a true, but we got a false. And that's because I didn't change how we're stubbing out proclamation on the game fairy. So if I change this to a true, boom, they're now both passing. This is what we wanted to do. So now we've effectively stubbed out this object that has a chain message on it, or this method that is essentially using chained messages, and we replace them with doubles in place. So this is kind of what RSpec in their documentation for receive chain methods was getting at. We want to use doubles in place of the receive chain method, so that way we could customize each part of the message chain with exactly what we want. So here, again, all we care about is testing out the done method on the game class, and we've stubbed out the two. So but unfortunately, I mean, one thing I want to point out here is we could do this better, and this is what I want to do next. So let's do this. So both of them are stubbing out the same thing. So I'm going to take out one of them. We're going to put it up into the describe. So that will allow them both to be able to use it. But we're going to have to wrap it in a before block. All right. But we don't want them both to be returning true. So we're going to say proclamation something, the outputs, just for the lack of a better variable here. And we're going to take these two out. And now what we're going to say here is, because we have the context, we can say let's, and we're going to say our proclamation output that we're using in our stubs. And we're going to say this one was false. Helps if I can do this right. I mean, this is just how I do it, so it's syntactically fine with the other way. Yeah. So let's see if this runs. So essentially what we've done was we've moved out those stubs to the outer describe. We've added a variable, a helper variable here called proclamation output. I think it's actually helper method maybe. And what we're doing is we're essentially assigning that in the contexts where it's appropriate. So in the game fairy saying that there's a tie, we're saying that it's false, and where we say that there's a winner, we're saying true. So we've saved this. Let's run it. Okay, we are not working, but only one of them, so interesting. Proclamation output. Did I spell it wrong, maybe? Oh, I put it in the wrong place. Okay. There we go. And they both pass now. So, just to be on the safe side, we're going to change these up. I mean, you don't have to believe me, but I'm just going to do this. It's only going to take a second, just to make sure that everything is working how I expected it to. Now they should both fail, and they both do. So there you go. This is how this came up this past week for me, and this is how I got around not using the receive message chain. The reason why we have to do this was because we couldn't figure out how to get receive message chain to work properly. So instead of using that, we went ahead and put a few things or we represented a few objects with some doubles, and by doing that we were able to use receive and then return the proper thing that we wanted to. Granted, it's a little bit bigger than what we had with the receive message chain, but the idea here is we're not using that, we're not relying on that, and we're able to have a little bit more control over what we're trying to stub and mock. I will have a accompanying blog post on this in a little bit, hopefully sometime today or maybe later, but the idea here is if you need this to do this type of testing, at least now you know how. So thank you for joining me. My name is Dan Clark. You can visit me at BruisedCoding.com. I am also known as @DanClark on Twitter. Feel free to hit me up with any questions you might have, and thanks and have a great day.